Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Michael Rosen. I'm the chair of the Getty Research Institute Council. Welcome to the annual Thomas and Barbara Gutkin's lecture series. This was established by the council a number of years ago in honor of the immediate past director of the Getty Research Institute, Thomas Gutkins, and his wife, Barbara. The Getty Research Institute Council supports the many activities and scholarly work that's done at the Getty Research Institute. Over the years, we've welcomed over 2,000 scholars from almost every place on Earth to come here to Los Angeles to access the literally millions of pieces of information and archives that we have here to help pursue the work that they're doing across so many disciplines. Surrounding and the connection that these disciplines have all with each other. We're very fortunate today to have an extraordinary lecture from Heghnar Watenpaugh, who is one of the world's leading experts on the topic of genocide, and she'll be talking about the connection between genocide and art and culture, or perhaps it's the connection between art and culture and genocide. I'm not quite sure which way the causality works. But perhaps we will find that out. It's also a pleasure to welcome her back home. She holds 3 degrees from UCLA, so Los Angeles, in some sense, is a home. So it's a privilege to welcome her. But for a more proper introduction, I'd like to ask the current director of the Getty Research Institute, a world-renowned scholar herself, Mary Miller, for a proper introduction for our guest. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good afternoon and good evening. Hello to you wherever you are. And if you are joining us via live stream in a different time zone, other than here in Southern California. And if you come to this talk on a different day altogether in the future, welcome. As Michael says, I'm Mary Miller, director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm delighted to thank the Council of the Research Institute, which hosts this annual lecture. It is, first of all, though, I have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of. So if you're listening on Zoom, you may select your language by enabling the interpretation feature, which is a little globe icon. I can't point to it because I'm looking at a piece of paper, but you want to click on the little globe icon on the bottom of the screen, and you can select your preferred language from among multiples. You may also select the words that say mute original audio feature to avoid hearing the language that is being spoken here at the podium at the same time. And you can, this information is in the chat if you need to check in on it. And before I continue, I want to thank everyone behind the scenes today, especially Beth Morrison in the Getty Museum and William Ramirez at the GRI, but also the staff who have been racing around to make all of this possible today. And I try to thank as many of you as I can in person. And I also want to thank the staff that is setting up the reception this afternoon. The GRI is so grateful to its council, which supports philanthropic projects of the GRI across many dimensions. So they sponsor acquisitions, visiting scholars and researchers, and public programs. We also spend time together away from the Getty, traveling both nationally and internationally. And so we come to know each other, and we get to know each other pretty well. It's really a wonderful group. I thank the council for not only for their support of the program, but also for their friendship to me personally. And so I've been thinking that in about a year from now, it will almost certainly be my successor who will introduce this talk, which has gotten me in a slightly historical frame of mind. I'm reminded that over 1,400 days ago, we hosted this event exclusively on Zoom. I was in my kitchen, our speaker was in Paris, our interlocutor was in North Carolina, and then years pass. As you will be reminded by the work we are about to hear today, art historians are historians, and we remember the past across terms, both short and long. This year, we have an extraordinary number of friends and colleagues signed up at Zoom, but I'm also so struck by how many are here in the Williams Auditorium today with us. And the colleagues online are subscribed from, yes, obviously from many places across the United States, but also from, and I'll just give you a sampling of where people are listening in live today: Canada, China, Greece, Egypt, Portugal, Cyprus, Mexico, Taiwan, Uruguay, and Russia. And then this will be on the Getty YouTube channel in about 2 weeks. So if you should walk in late and miss what I'm saying altogether, I just want to tell your friends that this will be available on YouTube in 2 weeks. And for those of you who are new to the Getty, if this is your first program here online or in person, please don't let it be your last. Please come back now that you have found your way to us. Our scholar theme this year at the Research Institute is extinction. And we have sought to thread the theme through much of our work since the new academic year began. I should add that our theme for the year that will launch next September of 25, and I feel as though those applications sitting on my computer are already looking at me, making me feel guilty. But the next year's theme is going to be repair, perhaps a response to extinction. But today we are here with extinction, and we're here with Heghnar Zeytun Watenpaugh, professor of art history at the University of California, Davis. Professor Watenpaugh will consider the implications of genocide alongside the processes of making sacred sites into cultural patrimony and sacred objects into museum works. Her talk reflects on extinction and transformation into art and what this portends for art history and museums in the 21st century. As my colleague Michael Rosen just said, that Professor Watenpaugh returned to California having earned 3 degrees at our neighbors across the 405. And then she taught both at Rice in Texas and at MIT in Cambridge. Her first book, The Image of an Ottoman City, Architecture in Aleppo, received the award for the best urban history from the Society of Architectural Historians. It is the story of Aleppo, Syria, which of course has been much in the news in the past 2 weeks, and I look forward to reading it next. However, I started my deep dive into Professor Watenpaugh's work with what I hold in my hand, her second book, and I have one of the copies out from the Los Angeles Public Library because our copies in the Getty Library are all in circulation among staff. Everyone's been reading this book, The Missing Pages, The Modern Life of a Medieval Manuscript, and I encourage you all to read it, and perhaps as soon as possible. The book won many awards when it first came out, testaments to the double feature of the book's importance and its extraordinary readability. Shortly after the book was published, Professor Watenpaugh received a Guggenheim Fellowship, from which there is surely new work in the pipeline. You can ask her later, and we look forward. Now let us settle in for the work at hand in Professor Watenpaugh's talk. As scholars of genocide have shown, the genocidal process extends beyond the physical extinction of the targeted community to include the erasure, appropriation, or transfer of the community's assets. Getty, colleagues, friends, welcome, and welcome Professor Watenpaugh to the podium.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for that generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back in Los Angeles and to be back at the Getty, and I'm so happy all of you are here today, whether in person or online, and I'm very happy that my family is here, all my family, including my mother, who was my first teacher. So, and a shout out to William Ramirez and his team who have organized every detail of this. You made it look so easy, but I can imagine that it was not. So thank you. During the landmark exhibition on Armenian art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, this art lover was entranced with one of my favorite works of art. Here was the contemporary museum experience. A religious medieval painting was framed on a wall. A modern woman captured a photograph of the painting on her phone, and maybe later she posted it on her social media to the delight of her family, friends, and followers. The painting was the canon tables from the Zeytun Gospels in the collection of the Getty Museum. That exhibition was one of the most profound and inspiring in my recent memory, and I strongly believe that culture in all its diversity should be shared with the widest public, which is why I do not take it for granted. This medieval painting was not meant to be exhibited as a work of art. The complicated chain of events that brought this painting to the museum, that made it possible for us to view it and to be inspired by it, included tragic episodes. The Armenian Genocide is ultimately the reason why this painting ended up here, on the Pacific shore, in a city that also hosts the second largest Armenian community in the world, outside of Armenia, many of whom are descendants of genocide survivors. The Armenian Genocide began in 1915, and we still live with its lingering effects. The Ottoman Empire systematically exterminated its own indigenous Armenian community, causing an estimated 1.5 million to perish and forcing the rest out of their ancestral homelands. Genocide is not only the large-scale killing of a people, it is also the destruction of their culture and the looting of their possessions. Our discussion today aims at unraveling the intersection between art and genocide. Recognizing the origins of the canon table's presence in the museum is meaningful for Armenians, but also for museums. It points to the role that communities and art institutions can play together to work towards values like justice, dialogue, collaboration, that are at the heart of the most difficult questions in the art world today. In this talk, I will explore how genocide impacts objects and sites. Through the canon tables, I will consider how sacred items, which I call survivor objects, become artworks in museums. Then I will consider how the architectural heritage of Armenians was transformed into what I call captive sites, made into patrimony and official heritage that excludes them. The before and after photographs on the screen exemplify the destruction and looting of Armenian sacred sites. This is the monastery of St. John the Precursor, or Surp Karabed, near Mush in present-day central Turkey, the most important Armenian shrine in the Ottoman Empire. The movable objects within these architectural sites, from modest furnishings to priceless medieval treasures, were looted, stolen, confiscated, or transferred. This photograph shows survivors who managed to return to their hometown at the end of World War I, only to find their church ransacked and damaged. What was a tragedy for the people on the screen was for others an opportunity. Half a world away, Francis Kelsey, a professor of classics and an archaeologist at the University of Michigan, was following the news about the mass murder of entire communities in the Ottoman Empire. He sensed the urgency of retrieving works of art that may have escaped destruction. He began to raise funds for an expedition to the Middle East. Quote, "Not only have the Armenians been practically exterminated in certain large regions of Asia Minor, but the Greeks too are on their way to extinction," unquote. Kelsey believed that the Armenians had become extinct. That prompted him to rush to the Middle East. He wrote, quote, "This expedition would have as its aim to lure from hiding places and secure from unappreciative hands such manuscript treasures as yet remain in Greek or Syriac or Persian or Armenian. The possession of these and their proper preservation will be a gain to science of inestimable value," unquote. In other words, it was urgent to retrieve whatever survived of the culture of this extinct group and to bring it back to his museum in Ann Arbor for study and preservation. Now or never, in his words, was the time to purchase medieval manuscripts. Within months, Professor Kelsey was on his way. He and his team went to Istanbul, then by train to Konya, Adana, Aleppo, then further south to Palestine and Egypt. Kelsey's mission combined surveys of archaeological sites and the collection of art with the inspection of the work of American humanitarian organizations in the wake of the genocide, including the American Committee for Relief in the Near East, today known as Near East Relief. Kelsey's team, which included the photographer George Swain, documented the destruction of the Armenians, sometimes mere months after atrocities had taken place. On screen is their photo of the destroyed Armenian church in Konya. They also documented American humanitarian projects for survivors, such as this tent encampment for refugees near Adana. In Aleppo, which had the largest concentration of survivors, they surveyed an eye hospital and an orphanage. Kelsey's collecting was based on the assumption, common in his time, that historically significant objects are best preserved in the confines of Western museums, primarily for the benefit of his students and the American public at large. While it is true that the acquisition of these objects removed them from the vagaries of the art market and the risk of further loss, nevertheless, this process did not aim at maintaining the connection between religious objects and their faith communities. Kelsey's expedition shows that the genocide and the process of collection happened in a connected sequence. Kelsey's expedition marks the moment when the material culture of a community marked for extermination became commodities, collectibles, research materials, and eventually works of art. Kelsey was not the only actor on a collecting spree. It's just that his archive has been preserved. There were many others at different levels, from looters and street vendors to purveyors of antiquities and sophisticated art dealers in big cities. A whole cast of characters, in the words of Professor Michael Basler, who I believe may be here today, a whole cast of characters on whom research is more elusive. The entry of some Armenian artworks into the art world, coincided with the genocide, the violence of looting and dispersal, and entry into the more shadowy corners of the art market. I'm not arguing that every single Armenian manuscript in museum collections today was looted during the genocide. However, the fact remains that a large corpus of Armenian works made their entry into the art world in a single wave as a result of the disruptions of the genocide. Simply, for many medieval Armenian manuscripts, their provenance is genocide. Kelsey may have believed that Armenians were extinct, but his expedition's photographic record tells a different story, a story of survivors. The manuscripts collected by Kelsey and others were mourned as a loss by Armenian intellectuals and faith leaders. The Archbishop Ardavas Surmeyan, the man who is standing in this photograph, wrote about witnessing the desecration and destruction of Armenian culture in terms of intense physical pain. He observed junk dealers selling religious vessels and vestments in the streets. Once, as he was purchasing food, the seller wrapped olives in a piece of parchment that had Armenian writing. At the sight of the medieval script, Surmeyan felt he was, quote, choking. Another Armenian eyewitness, then Bishop Babken Güleserian, wrote about the destruction of the body of the Armenian community and the mutilation of religious manuscripts in the same terms. To him, sacred objects and people shared the same fate. The suffering of one was equivalent to the loss of the other. The man on the screen, another Archbishop, Garegin Hovsepian, headed the Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church in New York in the late 30s and early 40s. He was a scholar of Armenian manuscripts who had visited churches all over the Ottoman Empire. However, since the genocide, many of the manuscripts he had studied had disappeared. Now he witnessed the sudden appearance on the art market in New York of holy books. He wrote, quote, "Now that manuscript has arrived in America as the property of a private person. It has been brought here to be sold," unquote. He was distressed at the dispersal of holy relics that had become commodities, communal religious treasures that were presented as private possessions. He worried that sacred objects were in profane hands and in profane places. Archbishop Hovsepian kept track of sacred manuscripts in circulation through a network of art historians, art dealers, and museum officials. One day, a genocide survivor and recent immigrant to Massachusetts named Nazaret Atamian came to show him a set of illuminated pages. That's the black and white photo on the screen. Atamian explained that the pages came from a Gospels from Marash, the family's hometown, and that the rest of the Gospels had been left behind. Archbishop Hovsepian immediately suspected the pages to be the work of Toros Roslin, the greatest Armenian medieval illuminator. He suspected that they might be from a famous manuscript he had not had the chance to see, known as the Zeytun Gospels, kept in a church not far from Marash. We now know that Hovsepian's instinct was correct. The pages he published in black and white photographs are today located not far from where we are, in the collection of the Getty, which purchased them decades later in 1994. Earlier today, the senior curator of manuscripts, Elizabeth Morrison, very kindly organized viewings of these pages for several small groups, and I'm very happy to have a chance to thank Elizabeth. It was deeply meaningful. Thank you. These pages are canon tables. They appear at the beginning of Gospels manuscripts and accompany a preface. Under an arch, between the columns, there are grids filled with letters of the Armenian alphabet that stand for numbers. These numbers are concordance lists of passages that narrate the same events in the life of Christ in two or more of the four Gospels. In medieval Gospel books, canon tables were often the pages that received the most elaborate aesthetic treatment, the most amount of gold. Toros Roslin, the artist, intended the canon tables to be seen as 4 pairs in 4 matching sets. This is the first matching set. As you opened the book, your eye was supposed to move from one page to the facing page, locating similarities and differences like a refined spot the difference puzzle. I'm showing you a digital reconstruction of the page's original sequence. So this is the second matching set, the third one, and the fourth one. However, here at the Getty, the canon tables are not part of a codex or a book, but rather separated from a manuscript. They exist as 4 bifolia, or large folded sheets of parchment. The fact that the pages are deconstructed, if you will, makes it difficult to view them in the sequence that the artist intended. Therefore, when a pair of canon tables is displayed, one is looking at a pair of illuminated pages, such as here, but not the pages that were intended to be seen together. What one sees on display is not a matching set, and the 2 pages do not appear in the correct sequence. In other words, the way we as viewers experience these pages now, in storage or on exhibition, is a different experience of the work that one would have if it was still in a book. And of course, this is true of any illuminated page detached from a manuscript. When one observes the bifolium of the canon tables today, and I apologize for the bad photo, but there's a reason why I'm using it, one can still see the small holes in the vertical fold at the center of each bifolium, and here they are. And earlier today, Dr. Morrison showed us the significance of these phenomena. So these are the holes where the threads that bound the manuscript together originally in the book once were located. One also notices another feature that does not lend itself to photography here. A crease extends horizontally across the 2 connected pages. This crease was likely caused when the pages were removed from the main manuscript and folded up. I have come to see this crease as a scar. It marks the moment when the work became a fragment, the trace of its loss. The crease is not a defect. Instead, it is a clue through which the object tells its own story. Scholars of manuscripts often encounter illuminated pages removed from manuscripts for many different reasons. In this case, the separation of the pages happened as a result of the genocide and its aftermath. The person who removed them, we now know, a young boy named Hagop Atamian, wanted to keep a piece of the holy book that entranced him, that he knew had to be left behind when the family were forced to migrate. It so happens that fortunately, some might say miraculously, not only the canon tables, but the main manuscript of the Zeytun Gospels too has survived. It made its own way in time and space to the Republic of Armenia, where it is preserved at the Mashtots Institute for Manuscripts, known as the Madenataran. In my book, The Missing Pages, I tell the biography of this extraordinary manuscript, the paths it crossed and the places it encountered along with the Armenian people, as well as the mysteries that still shroud its journey. The Zeytun Gospels was created, in 1256 in the castle of Hromgla, present-day Rumkale, on the Euphrates River in southwestern Turkey. On the site where Toros Roslin and a whole scriptorium of artists once created exquisite manuscripts, nothing acknowledges their presence, and nothing explains why there are no longer any Armenians. The genocide took place in the Ottoman Empire, yet the successor state, the Republic of Turkey, pursues a proactive policy of denial and discrimination against Armenians. Here in the very place where the Zeytun Gospels was created, It was as if it had never existed. The manuscript is called the Zeytun Gospels after the remote mountain town where it last functioned as a devotional object. Until the genocide, it was kept in the Church of the Holy Mother of God on the citadel of Zeytun. This photograph was taken a few years before the genocide. It is a streetscape in Zeytun. These men were among the last people to know the Zeytun Gospels as a sacred object. They did not conceive of the Gospels as a work of art. For them, it was a breath of God, Astvazashunsh, the Armenian name for the Bible. It was an object of tremendous power because it was scripture. As an ancient book enhanced with precious materials and ornaments, it was an object with its own agency. It was powerful. It performed miracles. It protected its people. It could punish enemies. It was not an inert object, but an active shaper of the world. And of course, we are under its protection, whether we know it or not, because the canon tables are here. The book's power had little to do with its illuminations that we appreciate so much today. In fact, very few people, only priests or learned elders, ever got to open the Gospels and look at these incredible images. The people of Zeytun only saw the manuscript on special occasions or during times of great danger, when a priest removed the book from its special box and held it up over the congregation, who saw only a closed book with a glittering binding. Art historians are increasingly accounting for the agency of objects through insight from anthropologists like Alfred Gell. On the site of the citadel of Zeytun, I stood on the ruin of the Church of the Holy Mother of God. I realized that the Zeytun Gospels was the only sacred object to survive from the centuries-old Armenian churches and monasteries that once dotted these mountains, their treasuries full of miraculous relics, precious vessels, and exquisite manuscripts. The Zeytun Gospels, the fragment and the whole, exemplify what I call survivor objects. These are objects that have endured genocide, war, exile, along with their communities. The Zeytun Gospels is exceptional in its survival, and it stands for all the objects, a whole cultural universe that was destroyed. Of course, it did not survive unscathed. The two sections of the Gospels are separated and have suffered some losses. Moreover, their function was transformed. This slide shows how Gospel books are central to contemporary Armenian religious practice. This is a living faith. Unlike the books in these images, both the canon tables in Los Angeles and the main manuscript in Armenia are no longer available for use in liturgy. Rather, they have a second life as museum objects. Believers can only approach them behind glass. Museums preserve the survivor object, and through exhibition and digital reproduction, it can reach more audiences than ever. These are positive things. In art museums, the object's artistic aspects are emphasized, while their recent history, with its link to genocide and displacement, is less commonly acknowledged. This can create tension with the fact that survivor objects often play outsized roles in processes of survival, restitution, and commemoration. They also make different demands on us as viewers and on museums as institutions. The journey of many survivor objects to museums involved unsavory episodes, looting, massacre, exploitation, that clash with contemporary collection ethics. The canon tables were the subject of a lawsuit brought by the Western Prelacy of the Armenian Church of America. That lawsuit was resolved through a settlement in September 2015. The settlement clarified that the objects were the property of the church, and the church in turn donated the pages to the Getty, thus correcting the historical record. The Getty became the first museum to restitute Armenian art removed from the genocide. Importantly, the settlement also looked to the future, the possibility of the museum's greater engagement with Armenian art, and also the Armenian community's greater engagement with the museum. Perhaps the fact that so many of us are present here today suggests that this dialogue between museum and community remains vital. And while a sacred object in an art museum no longer functions in liturgy, nevertheless, it retains the potential to be reactivated one day. In contrast to portable works of art that can circulate around the globe, architecture is rooted in place. Architectural traces of Armenian presence in today's Turkey had a very different fate over the last 100 years. The Armenian community in Turkey, now less than 1% of the population and mostly confined to Istanbul, has jurisdiction over only a limited set of Armenian religious sites throughout the country. Professor Melissa Bilal, who is a member of Turkey's Armenian community, wrote, quote, "Turkish official heritage regime operates on a definition of heritage crafted to reproduce an epistemology of denial," unquote. In other words, official state heritage in Turkey presents a version of Turkish history where the genocide is denied and from which Armenians are largely erased. Today, I focus on Ani as an example of a cultural heritage site in Turkey with a strong connection to Armenians. In 2016, the World Heritage Committee of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, formally inscribed Ani on the prestigious World Heritage List. The site is controlled by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and therefore very much part of official heritage. Once a glittering medieval capital, it is today a stunning city in ruins located on the Turkish side of the border that separates the modern states of Turkey and Armenia. Armenia and Turkey do not have diplomatic relations, and the border crossings are closed. For Armenians worldwide, Ani is an architectural masterpiece, a cultural touchstone, and a sacred site. Medieval chroniclers called it the city of 1,001 churches. While the site features structures built by many dynasties and groups, including the Muslim Seljuks, it is the Armenian layer that remains central to the city, as Ani comprises some of the most important monuments of Armenian architecture. Ani's importance as a capital city on the Silk Road faded in the later Middle Ages as commercial routes shifted. Nevertheless, Armenian communities continued to inhabit the area around it, and Ani remained a pilgrimage destination. Beginning in the 19th century, Ani also came to the attention of travelers, photographers, and eventually archaeologists affiliated with the Russian Empire. The Ani excavation by Nikolai Mar, seen here, and his team began to reveal the extraordinary history of this site. Until the First World War, Ani was a key site for Armenian church leaders and intellectuals. Here is a photograph of the Catholicos, or the head of the Armenian church, Mateusz Izmirlian, during a patriarchal visit to Ani. He is posing alongside the statue of the medieval Armenian king Gagik that archaeologists had discovered. So he's making a parallel between himself and a medieval sovereign. After the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, the continued presence of Armenian architectural traces in the country became a problem. How does official state heritage deal with architectural remains linked to the now vilified and minoritized Armenians, especially when these remains have long been recognized as masterpieces of world architecture and have tremendous cachet for international heritage organizations? For much of the 20th century, Ani fell in a sensitive military zone due to its location on the border between Turkey and the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was one of two land borders between a NATO-affiliated state and the Soviet Union. During this time, Ani endured decades of neglect and intentional damage. After the end of the Cold War and through the 1990s, there was a period of destructive interventions and damaging archaeology. One of the questionable interventions, when the city walls were rebuilt, the cross on top of the iconic lion relief on the entrance gate was removed. As a result, international heritage organizations like the World Monuments Fund of New York included Ani on their watch list of monuments in danger 4 times in a row, in 96, 98, 2000, and 2002. A shift began in the later 2000s. A new plan was devised for the site under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, but now with the support and advice of international heritage organizations, most importantly the World Monuments Fund, as well as the progressive Turkish non-governmental organization Anadolu Kültür. In this period, selected monuments were conserved in a more thoughtful manner, even though much remains to be accomplished. I'm showing you this approach through one of the churches at Ani, the Church of Dikran Honens. Following a thorough study in 3D imaging, which is what you're seeing here, the church was stabilized with minimal rebuilding. Many of the interventions, these new interventions, were made by a team led by the architect Yavuz Özkaya. Recently, an app put together by the Turkish NGO Anadolu Kültür with funding from the Gulbenkian Foundation offers an alternative interpretation of the site. Nevertheless, the problematic interventions of the past remain in place, such as the ramparts, such that Ani stands today as a virtual museum of preservation practices, both bad and good, from outright erasure and vandalism to current ideas about preservation as privileging minimal intervention and respect for all layers of building. Even in this new era, however, the Armenian community in Turkey is almost completely excluded from any input or participation in heritage making or any religious activity at Ani. Furthermore, the Armenian layer of Ani's history remains downplayed in its official signage and official interpretation, not the app. The app is a bit more informative. Even when the signage indicates the names of rulers, churches, or dynasties, official publications rarely, if ever, use the term Armenian, either to describe the ethnicity of former inhabitants, the religion to which churches are dedicated, or the alphabet and language of the inscriptions. In other words, you could visit this site and never know that these were Armenian churches. Ani's Armenian layer is rendered invisible, or at least illegible. Ani is also cut off from the Republic of Armenia, despite its extreme proximity to it. The continued lack of diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey and the closed border mean that citizens of Armenia must travel through a third country or through Istanbul to visit a site central through their culture and faith. Ironically, the best location for a panoramic view of Ani is on the Armenian side of the border, where the young people in this photograph are standing. You can view Ani from Armenia, but you cannot visit. The Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and critic Peter Balakian writes, quote, "Whether an Armenian looks from across the border in Armenia or anywhere else, the ruins of Armenian culture inside present-day Turkey are captive sites to which Armenians have no organic or even accessible relationship," unquote. The image Balakian evokes, an Armenian looking toward Ani across the border, barred from entry, illustrates the power dynamics at play. I borrow Balakian's formulation of captive sites to describe the process by which sites like Ani are incorporated into official heritage while excluding Armenians from it. Ani is often invoked when discussing possible diplomatic openings between Turkey and Armenia. The notion of cultural heritage as a medium for reconciliation also features in contemporary international heritage discourse. Ani was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List at a time when UNESCO emphasized sites connected to historical conflicts, with the idea that cultural heritage could be developed alongside diplomatic processes of dialogue. It aspired to foster heritage as a medium for celebration, healing historic wounds, even reconciliation. This is a wonderful ideal, but it is a tall order even in the best of circumstances. For many activists, this forced celebration of diversity fell short of acknowledging the past or committing to human rights in the future. Rather, it allowed Turkey to seize upon the rhetoric of multiculturalism to bolster its cultural capital without taking responsibility for the past. Recent events make it difficult to be optimistic. Following the attempted coup of July 2016, the Turkish state became increasingly authoritarian. A chill now permeates archaeology, art history, and certainly any activism on behalf of Armenian heritage. Activists who had worked hard at making Ani a place of Turkish-Armenian dialogue, like the prominent Turkish public intellectual Osman Kavala, are now imprisoned, and he has been condemned to a life sentence. The prospect that Ani might serve as a model of inclusive preservation and of heritage as reconciliation remains precarious, and Ani remains a captive site. The intersection of cultural heritage and genocide is not only a matter of history, it is also a pressing contemporary issue. Experts have long recognized the links between the intentional destruction of cultural heritage and discrimination, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Most instances of the destruction of culture around the globe are met with near universal condemnation, such as the case of the destruction of Palmyra seen on the screen. But accountability has been elusive, as has prevention. The local and international communities are hobbled in their response to such situations. Few international instruments have the teeth to defend cultural rights and cultural heritage in danger beyond merely issuing statements of concern. Here, contemporary Armenian cultural heritage has lessons to impart. Let's look further east to the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which Armenians call Artsakh. And let's look at the very recent past, including the 2020 war that culminated in fall 2023 in the ethnic cleansing of the Armenians of this region by Azerbaijan, which many call the Second Armenian Genocide. Genocide is not merely history, it is taking place now in the present and not only in Karabakh. These events prompted an ongoing lawsuit which aims, among other things, at preventing the destruction of cultural heritage and demanding accountability for past crimes against heritage. In 2021, Armenia instituted proceedings against Azerbaijan before the International Court of Justice, the main judicial organ of the United Nations where states can sue each other. The lawsuit alleged violations of the International Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, known by the acronym CERD. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan are parties to the CERD Convention. Briefly stated, Armenia is arguing that Azerbaijan subjected Armenians to state-sponsored policy of racial discrimination, including mass killings, torture, and for our purposes, the destruction of cultural heritage. The case is complex, and the intentional destruction of sites of cultural and religious importance to Armenians has been one of the features of Azerbaijan's policy since the 1990s. Following the war, Azerbaijan gained control of thousands of Armenian sites. Danger looms over them as their ongoing destruction and appropriation by Azerbaijan is well documented, and it is linked to official statements denigrating Armenians. Once cultural heritage is destroyed, it is irreparably lost. The Getty Trust was one of many international heritage organizations to issue a statement on the urgent need to protect Armenian cultural heritage in this region. It takes years for the International Court of Justice to reach a decision on the merits. In the meantime, the court indicated provisional measures. These are emergency orders intended to halt any violation that is likely to cause irreparable harm. That is the measure that the court has to apply. The ICJ granted Armenia's request to order Azerbaijan to, quote, prevent and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage, including but not limited to churches and other places of worship, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts, unquote. Clearly, the ICJ recognized the urgency of the threat of irreparable harm to cultural heritage, but they also recognized, at least at this stage, the link between racial discrimination and the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. This is a major win for cultural heritage and human rights. The ICJ's order may turn out to be a rare mechanism to pressure intransigent states to protect all cultural heritage on their territory, including those of groups subject to discrimination. While the lawsuit is ongoing and the enforceability of these decisions is still a question, nevertheless, new ground has been broken in international law. A new avenue has been opened to prevent harm to cultural heritage at the highest levels of the international judiciary realm. The documentation for these arguments is extensive. It involves not only the work of lawyers, and I'm showing you Yerishe Kirakosyan, who is the agent of Armenia, the main lawyer for the Armenian team. So not only the work of lawyers, but also the unsung labor of archaeologists, archivists, librarians, art historians, and cultural heritage activists. This is not simply about researching heritage and researching abuses to heritage. It is about relentlessly pursuing the ethical, legal, and economic implications of this research. In his own way, a century ago, Professor Kelsey felt the urgency to preserve cultural heritage for future generations, quote, now or never. Many of us today also feel the urgency to mobilize to protect heritage before it is lost forever in Karabakh and in many other places around the world. Our ideas about the ethics of collecting, the responsibility of museums, restitution, and the protection of cultural heritage have changed and continue to change. We need to understand the legacy of past scholars and art institutions in spite of our differences, and we need to engage them in collaboration to face the daunting challenges of the 21st century art world. Alternative futures are still possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heghnar. And now Heghnar and I are going to sit in these seats, and we're going to start with a bit of a conversation, and then we look forward to trying to engage in a slightly broader conversation with those of you who have joined us today in person. So moving over here. And what picture would you like behind us?
The canon tables.
Yes, could we have the canon tables behind us? Perhaps someone can move the images. And in fact, I'd like to go back and ask you some questions about the canon tables, and I have to say that today's viewing was for me an incredibly moving and just valuable experience to be in the presence of such extraordinary beauty, as well as that it is the beauty itself that is so charismatic about these objects. If we go back to the moment at which the pages were separated from the manuscript, I have to say, as an art historian, I find it a little surprising that you said it was a very young person who made the separation. How that young person did not immediately turn to the images of the gospel makers themselves, because when I think about all the manuscripts, medieval manuscripts I've studied, Carolingian Gospels, Lindisfarne Gospels, and wherever they were made across Europe, that there are very beautiful pages elsewhere in the manuscripts, but the images of the human agents of writing and inscribing are what draw me in. And I just, why is there any resistance to having taken the images of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
I've tried to think about that a great deal, and I know that Elizabeth Morrison has too. Why did this young boy at a very difficult moment in his and his family's life, they had just survived what some people here will know, the Battle of Marash in February of 1921. And the family knew that they had to leave Marash, and they had one chance to immigrate to the United States. They were going to take it. Through a number of improbable events, this book, which had been lost in the snow in a snowstorm and had been found by someone who was haunted by dreams, came into the possession of the father of this young boy. And so the family had a chance to look at the book, which of course to them, they were not art historians, they were not literate, so to them it was just an incredibly beautiful book full of gold. The family and the elders of the Armenian community made the decision that because their path was going to be very treacherous moving out of Marash, that they had to leave the book behind. And it so happens that they left it behind, and they entrusted it to an American missionary, the Reverend Lyman. But decades later, Hagop Atamian left a testimony of why he did this. He was entranced by the book. He felt terribly that they had to leave it behind. He said he wanted to keep it to show that their lives in Marash had existed. It was a memento of these terrible events. I too have wondered, why didn't he gravitate towards the narrative paintings of the evangelists that are more accessible for us as modern people? The canon tables, in spite of their incredible beauty, are more abstract. They're difficult to read. What do they represent? And especially if you're 13 years old, how do you connect with these? In the end, I think my best speculation is that because those holes in the center of the bifolia are still intact, that probably means that the thread that was connecting that particular choir or gathering had come detached. And so these books could more easily be removed. And so these pages could more easily be removed. It could be as simple as that. And he didn't have a lot of time. He made an impulsive decision, so he took them and he kept them. And they were kept in the family for 70 years. Until a family member sort of a different kind of person decided that they could be sold. So that's my best guess.
Extremely, extremely interesting. But I think that idea that able to be removed without further damaging the manuscript indeed must have been both dangerous and yet possible. I'm sure that there are many questions that people in our audience have today. I'm looking at our colleagues who may have microphones. We will entertain your questions to the best of our ability.
Professor Watenpaugh, that was really an amazing lecture. Thank you so much. I'm worried about Syria, what's going on right now. Can you tell us about that?
And this is being, we are taping this. I'm not going to ask if our guest speaker would, whatever she wants to answer, whatever she doesn't want to answer, we will do our best to stay on the topic of what she has spoken about. But
Thank you, Michael. I think Syria is on many of our minds, especially since many of us have connections to Syria and to Syrians and to Syrian culture. And of course, we're at the Getty, where as an institution has a great connection, especially to Palmyra and other ancient Syrian sites. Obviously, it's a time of, for our Syrian friends, it's a time of incredible liberation, of the fall of a regime that has been around all my life. It's an incredible, almost unbelievable thing. Like all our Syrian friends, we're all looking to see what will happen next. It's one of those moments where so many futures are possible. And will the best future prevail, I think, is the anxiety.
And just to ask a little bit more, Aleppo is one of the many places in Syria, but certainly it is the subject of your first book and one of the great centers of Armenian culture overall. And is it a place that people will be returning to now in order to think about the power of historical narrative to reanimate the city?
I think that's the key question. I know that many people want to return to Aleppo. I know I do. I want my children to see Aleppo, and to find ways to reconnect the elements of society that had been sundered, to rebuild for better futures. So will that be possible? What shape will that take? Will it be in keeping with ideals of democracy and human rights? I think remains a question.
And because of your work on the architecture of Aleppo, I just also have wanted to know a lot more about the architectural image that is now behind us, that am I correct in perceiving that these small pages, because they are not large, somehow compress, make architecture something that can be captured on a page, and then spiritually you are stepping through these portals? When I saw the picture early on in your talk of the refugee children with the portals behind them, and I thought, oh, what is this a traditional part of Armenian presentation of space and religiosity?
Canon tables do traditionally take the form of arches, so there's an architectural overall shape in all of the cultures that use canon tables at the beginning of gospel books. But as it so happens, we are very fortunate to have a treatise on canon tables that was written by a church father who worked in Rumkale or medieval Romgla, the same place where the canon tables were created. Nerseshnor Hali, maybe some members of the audience are familiar with his work. For him, canon tables were very important. They had to be done in a particular way. For him, the birds that are present that symbolize certain things about, the soul, yearning for salvation. But he also talked about the ornamental passages of canon tables as media for contemplation. And truly, if you spend time, you could spend many, many minutes. I've spent many hours absorbed in the canon tables. And I discover new visual events every time I look at them. They're just extraordinarily rich. And I can see that a medieval believer would enter a kind of zone or state of contemplation and understanding through these very abstract passages. So yes, they are portals to understanding.
Hello? Hi, I'm interested in how much of the story can you tell us of how it was actually taken out of the country? Was it wrapped in cardboard and stuck inside the young man's shirt? Was it carried in a suitcase? Was it carried in a backpack while he literally walked across the desert? Is it planes, trains, and automobiles? How did this incredible thing get from there to here?
It must have gotten from Marash, where the family last was. Their first stop was Aleppo, which was a major transport hub. This probably took place between 1921 and 1923. And they probably traveled on horseback or by mule with some of their possessions. And at that time, because of the political instability, it was a very dangerous trek to make, which is why the family wanted to entrust the entire book to somebody reliable instead of taking it with them, because they felt they would be robbed. And many people, brigands thrive in instability. From Aleppo, they waited for their visa and they traveled by ship. Ellis Island has preserved, the archives at Ellis Island have their ship manifest where the entire family is listed, and they arrive in Massachusetts. They're listed as being Turkish because they were coming from the Turkish Empire. And they were admitted in Ellis Island and then immediately traveled to Massachusetts, where they had a family member who had immigrated there before the war. So the family was reunited and they continued to live there. And the family is still there. I've been in touch with the daughter of Hagop Atamian, Sonia Reeves. Hi, Sonia, if you're watching. And one of the very interesting things she told me is that her father, who was a very modest man, he had a small shop, grocery store in Watertown. The women in the family didn't know about this special object. It was shared with the men in the family. And it was, I imagine that it was probably in a drawer somewhere. And I'm so grateful that it was safe in that drawer. Clearly the men in the family took it out once in a while. And for them, this was a memento of their life before the war.
So the other part of the manuscript, the bulk of the manuscript, how did it get to what is today and obviously was part of the Soviet
Yes.
Union?
How does,
Yes.
tell us, do we know
As-
its story?
A little bit. As far as we can reconstruct, the Reverend James Lyman did keep his promise. He had told the Armenian community of Marash that he would keep this book safe with him and eventually give it back to the Armenian church. And he did it. I'm not exactly sure when, but he entrusted it to the library of the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul. So he did return it to the Armenian church. In the 1960s, there's two possible dates when this could have happened. The then Patriarch of Constantinople, whose name was Shnork Kalustian, he was a great leader of the Armenian church, and a very frequent visitor to the Center of Armenian Christianity in present-day Armenia, then Soviet Armenia. He took it as a gift to his sort of spiritual superior in the early 60s. So there's two possible dates when it could have happened, and it stayed in Etchmiadzin for some time before the church fathers in Etchmiadzin decided to gift many of the more conservationally vulnerable and historically important manuscripts to the Madinataran, which is a museum with, conservation program where these objects could be kept at the right temperature with the right humidity and be cared for and studied. So by the late 60s, the book had been moved to the museum where it is today.
Is the rest of the book available for viewing in that museum? Is it open to the public?
It is sometimes on display. I think one of the photos I showed you of the open book showing one of the evangelists, that photo was taken, I think, in 2012 when the book was part of an exhibition. It cannot be displayed very frequently because of the sensitivity to light and so on, just like the pages here cannot be on permanent display. It is available for researchers. It is very safe, kept in a storage area with other manuscripts and taken care of by a very, very wonderful group of curators.
I think I'm being told we've got time for one more question. I do see a hand over here, and someone is bringing you a microphone right now.
Thank you. Hello. Are any of the researchers working on this currently? And if they are, where are they from the world or in the world? Thank you.
On the manuscripts, or there's a there's a lot of people who work on manuscripts, which is great. There are, I believe there's a fellow at the Getty Research Institute
Yes.
now. Where is Whitney?
Whitney, are you here?
Here's a wonderful PhD student who is working on Armenian culture and manuscripts, right? And there are others in the United States, in Europe, and in Armenia. So it's actually a very vibrant scholarly area, and people approach it from many different perspectives.
And I just want to say that, of course, the great scholar and to be studied with is at UC Davis. She's here on the stage. It is also possible to study these works in and the larger historical context at institutions around the United States and in Europe and elsewhere as well. And their fragility means that by and large, most of the time, we are all working from photographic facsimiles, but that it is incredibly important to be able from time to time to be able to see the charismatic original manuscript, to understand the scale these things are often quite tiny, and to make your eyes slowly, as you said, experience a trance-like experience without necessarily understanding all the elements of the religious tradition, that these were meant to be transformative to the viewer. And I want to thank our speaker today for being a great detective, a great speaker. Thank you so much. Now, I believe we have a lovely reception set up outside, right outside the on the plaza where you came in. And I hope you will come up and introduce yourself. I think Professor Watenpaugh said she knows an extraordinary number of people in this room. But please come up and introduce yourself and continue the conversation among all of us.